In this video, I'm going to be making an Ash Waste fortress, a ramshackle improvised hideout in the polluted wastelands of Necromunda. Let's get right to it. The first thing I did for this project was make a large stone outcropping to base this structure around. I liked the idea of whoever is using the hideout having built it up around a network of caves. This fort-like structure will be built into the natural defense of a high rocky outcropping, like the headquarters of Immertan Joe in Mad Max Fury Road. So I stacked up a bunch of sheets of XPS foam, cutting them into the rough shape needed for the structure. With my rough shape figured out, I can mark a bunch of cave openings cut into the cliffs. Because I haven't glued the layers together yet, I can cut them very easily at this stage. I use a hot wire to do that. With my doors cut, I begin gluing the layers together. I reinforce the layers with bamboo skewers, which if you think about it is the exact same method they use to hold obnoxiously large sandwiches together. I know you know what I'm talking about, the kind that's too big to even practically take a bite from. I've always thought that was very silly, but it occurs to me as I say this that this is in fact an impractically large sandwich too, albeit of foam and adhesive. I'm no better than the delis. I guess I've lived long enough to see myself become the villain. I trim the foam some more with the hot wire cutter until the wire breaks. Now I thought about repairing the wire, but I watched First Blood recently, and John Rambo was able to start dry aging an artisan prosciutto in a cave after just a few days alone with nothing but a knife. So I think I can make do with just a knife as well. It's time to make this thing look more like real stone. I started by making a ton of horizontal cuts with my knife, reminding the foam at regular intervals that all I wanted was something to eat, and that it drew first blood. These cuts are going to simulate layers of sediment, so rather than hiding the layers between the foam, we'll just make more layers, and that will effectively hide the material that it's made from. It's time to start the exfoliation process. I retract the blade of my knife and begin scraping downwards on the foam. I'm incapable of not thinking about food while I make things, so the food that this most reminds me of is a giant rotating spit of shawarma meat being cut from the skewer. I recently learned that Mexico City's famous al pastor tacos are inspired by Middle Eastern kebab brought over by Lebanese immigrants. Now this has nothing to do with anything other than to tip off the audience that I'm recording this before lunch. If you've done this bit correctly, you'll be finding foam shavings everywhere for months after. You might want to open a few drawers and put a printer underneath your work surface to catch some of the shavings. Then again, you might not want to do this. Next, I use a wire brush to scrub off some of the remaining shavings and add more texture. This stage will leave some fine fuzzy bits of foam. I use a heat gun to melt these away, leaving a hard sealed surface. This is going to help durability in the long run as well, and it's very satisfying to do this bit. And there it is, the shape of the rocky bit. I imagine this was once part of a mine or something. It was a nice day, so I took the whole piece outside to cover it in a mixture of plaster and grey house paint. This mixture is going to further seal and unify the rock surface, and also add a nice matte finish. I originally bought this grey paint to paint an Iowa-class battleship, but then I remembered that I don't have one of those. Now the ozone layer was feeling a bit too thick above me at this point, so I decided to give it a few squirts with an aerosol can as well. Probably wasn't necessary. The best way to make something look like it was built with no plan is to just build it with no plan. So at this point I start gluing some pieces of foam core board around the cliffs, making little platforms and walkways. I build some little structures clinging to the rock like barnacles as well. This toy part that I found at the thrift store looks like a cool bit of machinery, so I glue that on near the top. I build a little structure around it which will hopefully make it look like it has some sort of function. I use bits of medium chipboard to block in the roof around it. As I build my way around the structure, I try to think of how somebody could make their way up the outside. Ever since I saw that scene in Spirited Away where Chihiro goes down those rickety stairs from the outside of the bathhouse, I've enjoyed precarious stairs like these. I don't put any railings or anything, which got me thinking about a dystopian world where there are no building codes. Now, the Warhammer 40,000 universe is certainly a dystopia, so that fits, but then I began thinking that it would be maybe even more dystopian if there were building codes, and they were so cost prohibitive and difficult to navigate that most people couldn't afford to adhere to them, and then maybe the government only enforces them selectively and capriciously, but they do so with an iron fist. Maybe the first battle that takes place on this piece would be the inhabitants defending their compound against a corrupt government who's trying to bombard and condemn their home because it didn't fit into a narrowly approved set of standard template specifications. That would be dystopian as well. Like most things, it seems like there's a sweet spot to avoid the dystopia. This place exists outside the sweet spot. Now, there may or may not be building codes in my imaginary world here, but the laws of physics certainly do apply. So many of these walkways and structures need some additional supports. Some of these I make out of chipboard, made to look like metal struts. Others I simply use bamboo skewers. The nice bit about basing the build on a big chunk of foam rock is that I can drive these skewers deep into the mountain, and the walkways become very sturdy indeed. I build a few scaffolding-like structures as well. These give a nice improvised look to everything. Using some plastic pipes, I make a pipeline rising up from the ground and going through the roof of one of my buildings. These pipes are from Temu. I'm always hunting for inexpensive toys and plastic bits to help my builds, so when Temu offered to sponsor this video, I agreed. I had a look at their online store and I chose a bunch of things that might be useful to crafters, and they sent me a nice sample package with these things in it. I was particularly pleased with these plastic pipes. I've used similar ones before, but these ones are bigger in gauge and diameter, so I was glad to add them to the collection. I also ordered various plastic trees and other things. My son is going through a bit of an obsession with garbage trucks, so for him I got these little garbage cans as well. I'm going to fill them with raisins and Cheerios. One thing I will say is it can be tricky to tell what size some of the things on Temu are based on the listings, so it's useful to consult the comments to get information from people who have bought before. Toy cranes, though, are something that can be useful no matter what the scale, so of course I got one of those. Overall, if you're in the market for some inexpensive toys and crafting supplies, Temu might be worth checking out. You can download the Temu app through my link in the description box to get a $100 coupon bundle for free, or search my code DKG7764 in the Temu search bar to claim it. In any event, I appreciate them supporting the channel. I clad all my buildings with corrugated paper, because once it's painted, it'll look like corrugated metal. In the meantime, I enjoy the bright colors. As I cover the buildings, I use a sharp knife to add some windows here and there. One thing I enjoy doing is making a small oriel window just on its own, and then gluing the whole thing right on. The roofs get covered in corrugated paper as well. I chose red because it reminds me of the glory days when Pizza Hut had those beautiful red roofs. Nowadays, new Pizza Huts are just in boxes, and it seems like a bit of a shame, but then when I actually think about it, I've never actually cared about the roof of any other restaurant. It certainly doesn't make the food taste any better or worse. On a previous project, I made some doors out of bits of card. I was about to do the same here when I realized that I'd made molds and cast some of those doors in putty. Very handy. I imagine most of these structures are accessible from the inside of the caves, so I didn't need too many doors to begin with, but it's a fun detail. I had a few bits of cereal box to the floors of my walkways to hide some of the seams and then add a bit more detail, and I also added some styrene beams and other various details here and there. At this point I used the toy crane that I mentioned before, cutting a small square hole to place it into. I want the crane to be easily removable for storage, so I wrapped a bit of card around the crane bottom and glued the card into the hole to reinforce the edges. Now that's a well-clad hole. To make ladders, I cut some sections from a cheap toy tennis racket. With With the last few ladders in place, this thing is ready to paint. I started with some spray paint, first black, then a spray of dark brown, but I did it in the garage in the middle of the night. And I didn't film it, so you're just going to have to take my word for it, but here it is with that black and brown spray paint on it. Maybe I did film it, just wanted an excuse to use a star wipe. You'll never know. There's a lot of overspray from the spray paint, so I painted the stone grey again with a few shades of thin paint. I don't think it looks very good at this stage, but a great art teacher I once had told me that it's okay for your work to not look good at every point in the process. I don't know who needed to hear that, but I think it's very wise. I applied some very thin light grey paint to the walkways. As it dries, it ends up looking like some ashy dust. I decided to add some more grit and texture to the corners, so I glued on some sand. I don't like sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere. When the sand is dry, I turn the whole thing upside down and shake it, kind of like the time that Suge Knight held Vanilla Ice upside down off a balcony. This may seem like a crazy take to some of you, but I think Vanilla Ice is underrated and deserves more respect. I paint over that sand with grey paint. Next, I dry brush the rock and all the sandy bits with light grey. It's gratifying to see the texture pop out, and you can see all the nice details in the rock face. I also dry brush all the metal areas with some silver paint. I mixed up a dark wash of however many parts water this is with however much black paint this is. I added a few drops of airbrush thinner as well for the surfactant quality. Of all the words I've learned since starting this channel, surfactant is probably the best one. I apply that wash to all the metal areas. For a final pop of color, I add some thin reddish brown speed paint to form rust streaks coming off the metal areas. And that's it. I always try to keep the paint scheme simple when I'm building pieces that are going to have miniatures on them. It helps to keep the attention on the miniatures, and it makes the piece more versatile in the long run. I'm really happy with how this turned out, and I hope you guys like it too. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Eric's Hobby Workshop.